Hey guys, Coach Pop here. Thanks for joining me for the video cast today. Today we're looking more closely at this idea of a Pax Mongolica, a Mongol peace that is created after Genghis Khan is able to conquer so much territory in Eurasia. If you remember this particular map, within a couple of generations, very shortly after um, Genghis Khan dies, particularly after Ogadai, his son, who is named the Great Khan, dies. The empire is split into separate khanates. This idea of a khanate, a military control government, but that employs bureaucrats from other civilizations, particularly Persian, Arab, and Chinese bureaucrats to sort of run their government for them. I want to take a look at each of these in turn today, starting with the Khanate of the Golden Horde, which is centered around Batu, who's one of the many grandsons of Genghis Khan, but one who is able to conquer territory in the northwest with the help of several other Central Asian nomads who joined their federation. He raids the Kievan Rus and, in fact, sacks the city of Kiev. And he's primed to take over the Kievan Rus and has intentions of moving west and to invade Europe itself. But then, when Ogadai dies, he's recalled back to Karakorum, the capital city, because it's not exactly clear who is going to take over, what's going to happen after his death. He's given a khanate in the northwest, which means he's sort of in charge of that particular territory, but he decides he's not going to invade Europe, nor is he going to occupy the Kievan Rus. Instead, he comes up with an idea to have them pay tribute to him. And it's a kind of fateful move, but one of the decisions he makes is the Prince of Moscow is going to be the one that collects tributes from the other princes as opposed to the Prince of Kiev. And this is a move to kind of like undermine the power of the Prince of Kiev, which is pretty smart as far as that goes. But a consequence of this is the princes all then start raising taxes. And when they raise taxes, the boyars, the landowners in the rural areas, then raise the taxes on the peasants. And the tax burden becomes so great on the peasants over time that they eventually become serfs. And if you remember, serfs are different from peasants insofar as they are literally bound to the land. They are not free to move, to go pursue other occupations. It's passed down from generation to generation. But another consequence of this is the Mongol influence affects Russian culture to such a degree that from the perspective of Western Europeans, they think of them as more like Central Asia than Western Europe. And so that divide that started with the Great Schism continues to become greater and greater. So again, the Golden Horde, the Kipchak Khanate, as it's sometimes called, that area in the northwest part of the territory that forms the Pax Mongolica and includes the Russian principalities, controlled by Batu and then his descendants later on. Another one, though, is the Ill Khanate of Persia. And this is focused on the activities of yet another grandson, Hulagu. Now, Hulagu takes the city of Kabul, which is currently in like northern Iraq, but it was a key center for the Abbasid Empire, and then starts to move from the east and towards the west. Specifically, he's moving towards the Anatolia Peninsula, what's now Turkey, and he defeats the Seljuks. If you remember, the Seljuks had taken Baghdad, declared themselves a sultanate, and left the caliph in Baghdad in charge of the church, but they were also attacking the Byzantine Empire and taking a great deal of the Holy Land, which is one of the factors that sparked the Crusades. They are now defeated, but as a consequence, another group of Turks, the Ottomans, will sort of take their place, particularly in Anatolia, where the Mongols and Hulagu and his descendants didn't seem to really have that much interest. They will eventually be the ones that take Constantinople and overthrow the Byzantines. We'll talk more about them later on. After he does all of this, though, he tries to take Egypt. And Egypt is controlled at that time by the Mamluks, who, if you remember, they had once been Turkish soldier slaves. And they were great warriors, but then converted to Islam, set up their own sultanate in Egypt, and they were able to actually defend themselves successfully against the Mongols. He takes the city of Baghdad in 1258. Hulagu does, that is to say, and that officially ends the Abbasid Caliphate. He's not interested in setting up a sultanate. It's a Khanate now. He's in charge, and the religious aspect of it is not really that important. But one of the consequences of all of the destruction left in their wake, first of all of the major cities are literally left in ruins, and the farmland around it is like totally trampled over. The Mongols had no sense of the value of soil as far as growing food, because they were only concerned with land as pasture, and literally the farmland just gets destroyed because it's turned into pasture for all of their horses. They don't recognize what they're doing. In the end, though, most of the Mongols in the Ill Khanate of Persia, being a minority, will assimilate. That is to say, they will transform into the dominant culture by about 1300. Now, this is a process similar to what happens in the Chagatai or Jogadai Khanate in Central Asia. There, many people became Buddhists. If you remember, Jogadai was one of the sons of Genghis Khan. He was given a khanate in this area that included the major cities on the Silk Roads. Most of these people, though, converted because they realized, like, they don't have to continue conquering people. They're settled people now making money off of trade, and Buddhism at the time was the most popular um, religion in that particular area, and so they just sort of assimilate into that. But in the case of the Ill Khanate, and then eventually the Jogatai or Chagatai Khanate, most of the Mongols will convert to Islam and become sort of settled, civilized people. They're city dwellers. They didn't start off that way, but like they just become that because they're surrounded by all of that and they see all of the benefits that it creates. So again, the Ill Khanate is sort of the southwestern part of the Pax Mongolia Khanates. Once the great empire is divided, the Chogatai or Jogadai Khanate right there in Central Asia. But let's turn our attention to the east, because what's going on there is really kind of unusual. First of all, the Khanate of the Great Khan, which is the area that includes the Mongolia, what's now Mongolia, uh, is eventually going to be controlled by Kublai, who yet again one of the grandsons of Genghis Khan. He conquered the Song dynasty, though. And if you remember, even Genghis Khan, as great as he was not actually able to take over the Song dynasty. And so as a consequence, he becomes the great Khan. He's the ruler of rulers of all of the Khanates, if you will. But then he does something really unusual. He establishes in China what's known as the Wan Dynasty. What's unusual about this is he recognizes what's going on with their history, and once he's conquered the Song, he actually claims the mandate of heaven. He's not Chinese. So this is kind of an unusual situation, but he's conquered them, and he feels like, well, that's kind of his right. He establishes a new capital city in what is now Beijing. At the time, it was called Dadu, but it's closer to Karakoram, which is also the capital city of the Great Khan. And he's now like kind of in both worlds. He's the Great Khan in Karakoram, but he's also the Chinese emperor in the new capital city of Beijing. But he also goes about overthrowing the social hierarchy that is the sort of hallmark of all Chinese dynasties. Yes, he claims that he's establishing a new dynasty, but he's going to make some dramatic changes in the social hierarchy. First of all, he puts Mongols and foreigners at the top of this social hierarchy. The foreigners, by the way, most of them are Persians and Arabs who are imported from other khanates to be the bureaucrats in China, which I mean that's going to have all sorts of consequences, as you can imagine. Second, he elevates merchants. Merchants are supposed to be at the bottom of the Confucian order. They're now moved up because, of course, trade is how the Mongols are making their wealth through the Pax Mongolica. And then the peasants are sort of in this weird situation, like they're supposed to be honored, but the Mongols don't really understand a whole lot about farming, but they do understand that they need food, so they're sort of in this precarious place. But the most dramatic changes come in the scholar gentry. The scholars who pass the examination system are now put at the bottom. Those who used to control the government are under Mongol rule under the Wan Dynasty put at the bottom, and the gentry are as well because they're the wealthy landowners who could sort of threaten the rule. So, in effect, what happens is the social hierarchy is kind of flipped upside down. Nonetheless, they do continue many of the economic policies of the Song dynasty, including the idea of using paper money and relying on a banking system. In fact, to this day, the monetary unit of China is known as the yuan. Even though the Song came up with it, the Mongols will continue it. So the Wan Dynasty then includes this territory that is like Mongolia and the surrounding areas, as well as much of China. It's a huge, huge territory. But one of the things that's unique about it is Mongols did not actually move into China and settle there. In fact, marriage between Chinese men and Mongol women was completely outlawed. They didn't really want a whole lot of mixing. Now, part of this has to do with different variations of patriarchy. In Mongol society, women were given way more freedoms than in typical Chinese society. And so there was this sense that they shouldn't actually mix. The women, the Mongol women, that is to say, maintained their high status, which they had in their pastoralist societies, even as they were now part of a larger empire. Foot binding was absolutely not practiced by Mongol women. Like they thought that was the dumbest thing that you could possibly do. Buddhism and Taoism, on the other hand, become relatively favored by the Mongols. They don't really see a problem with this. They themselves originally, if you remember, were animists and shamanists, but Buddhism and Taoism kind of blends with those pretty well. Confucianism, on the other hand, they don't see that as a positive thing at all. And so Confucianism is very heavily discouraged. The examination system is completely thrown out during the Wan Dynasty. It's gone. Like, who cares about these Confucian texts? Confucianism is stupid, so who cares? But in the end, the Wan Dynasty will be overthrown. In 1368, a new dynasty will emerge. That's where we're going to pick it up in the next lesson. That's part of the larger process of the decline and fall of the Mongols. For right now, the biggest thing to get out of today's lesson is the separation into four khanates of this giant empire that was earliest established by Genghis Khan. All of them are related, but they're all sort of, headed up by separate individuals initially, and then their dynasties, and yet all of them can combine to form this great idea we call the Pax Mongolica. I want to thank you for your attention, and I'll look forward to seeing you in class.